Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our live stream. Today we're going to be talking about the conservative Texas budget. We're going to talk about what it is, what it isn't, how it impacts legislators, how it impacts budget writers, how it impacts the process, and most importantly, how it impacts the taxpayers of the state of Texas. I'm Rod Bordelon. I am the policy director for the Remember the Texas Taxpayer campaign here at the foundation. We've got two esteemed colleagues of mine here as panelists. We have Dr. Vance Ginn, who is the chief economist with the foundation. We also have James Quintero, who is the policy director for the Government for the People campaign. So welcome, gentlemen, and appreciate you being here. Before I turn it over to our panelists and we begin discussion, I do want to set this up a little bit. We are in very challenging times. This is perhaps the greatest economic downturn, at least in a severity sense, in the last several decades. It's not the first time we've had economic challenges. It likely won't be the last time. We will rise to the challenge. It is our job here at the foundation to provide guidance and suggestions to the legislature, and that's what we're going to be doing in part with this conservative Texas budget. It is a signature effort here at the foundation. We've been undertaking this for a number of years, and it allows a structured approach to reining in the growth ultimately of the state budget. The challenges that I mentioned really that are upon us today are not just about actually determining how much to spend in the government budget, but also how to project what our revenue growth is going to be, how to project what the economic strength of Texas will be, how quickly will we get back to the economic strength that we realized before the pandemic hit sometime in February or March of earlier this year. That's what our panelists are going to be talking about a little bit today. But ultimately, what we also want to talk about is the fact that the challenges are not just upon the legislators, the budget writers, the comptroller, to try to determine what that economic growth and revenue projections and the needs of Texans will be. The challenges are ultimately on the taxpayers. The taxpayers pay for all that. The taxpayers have the same challenges, if not greater, of determining what their own economic well-being is going to be into the future, what their own income is going to be, their own ability to pay bills, including taxes. And that's why our campaign, Remember the Taxpayer, is so important. We look at all aspects of impacts on the taxpayer, but particularly the budget and the taxes. I did bring a prop with me today before we get started. It's actually not a prop. It's the state budget. If you print out the Texas state budget, this is what it looks like. It's over 900 pages. It's every single page nearly has dollar figures, a lot of them. Those dollar figures add up to almost $250 billion over a biennium. $500 billion for one state. And yet, I think Vance will get to this in a minute, Texas is in better shape than most states because of our economic strength, because of our ability to rein in the growth of government and constrain the budget to within the means of taxpayers' ability to pay and within the means of the economic growth that we have, the domestic state budget that we have. We're actually in much better shape than most states. Leading into this pandemic in February, we led the country for many years actually in economic growth. Our job growth, as reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think led the country for 115 straight months. And that was a record, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, since the time they had been recording that. We want to get back to that. We want to get back to the strength that Texas has economically. I think we're getting there. We're starting to see some improvements, but we've got a long way to go. And in the meantime, we've got to constrain the growth of government so that taxpayers and the economy can get back to that strength. So with that, let me turn over to Dr. Ginn. Vance, why don't you tell us, I guess, a little bit more about what the conservative Texas budget is, how you calculated it, and do the big reveal for us.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and do the reveal first, sure, if I could. So the conservative Texas budget for 2022-23 is there. It is So this is the conservative Texas budget for 22-23 on initial appropriations of $246.1 billion. As you mentioned, Rod, it's quite fascinating what's happened in Texas over a number of years, the economic climate that we've had here, what we call here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the Texas model, one of relatively less government spending, no personal income tax, which is huge, relatively less government taxes in general, and sensible regulatory climate. These are been the pillars of economic success for a number of years, and it's really what brings about the institutional framework that's inclusive, that allows for more economic growth so people can continue to prosper all across this great state. But that hasn't always been the case. There has been a while where we had excess government spending, and it was a period of time when you look back over a number of decades, even over the last couple of decades, since 2004 to 2015, those 5 budget periods, average annual growth rate or biennial annual growth rate, or biennial growth rate, get it right, of 12%, right? 12% growth rate. Well, what does that mean? How can we have some sort of a comparison? Well, when you look at population growth plus inflation, that's in our report that came out today. Population growth and inflation, the biennial growth rate was 7.3%. So in other words, the average growth rate of the budget was 5 percentage points higher than the taxpayers' ability to pay. And we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But, in 2015, we said, we really need something else to put as a threshold, a maximum threshold that the government should use to grow by so it better matches the taxpayers' ability to pay. And that's where we came up with the conservative Texas budget. It's a maximum threshold. Doesn't mean that you have to max it out every time. In fact, there may need to be zero growth in the budget, maybe even reductions in growth in the budget, especially given the times that we're in today. But those 3 biennial budgets since 2015, what we've seen is the average growth of the budget, initial appropriations, has been 5.4%, less than half of what it was in the 5 prior budgets. And the population growth plus inflation over that 3 budget periods was 6.3%. So since the conservative Texas budget's been put in place, which is a maximum threshold for the total budget for the Texas government to spend, and it's based on population growth plus inflation, okay? And it uses actual data. We use initial appropriations to initial appropriations, so that way you have actual data. And we use the past 2 fiscal years worth of population growth and inflation, so you also have actual data. None of these forecasts, no other ways to manipulate the numbers. These are what the data show. And when you look at that, it's been a success story, I think, not only from having this conservative Texas budget in place, but also given the state's leadership and legislative a body to say, you know what, we need to make sure that we can keep the growth rate of government from growing faster than taxpayers' ability to pay. And we've got to continue that. So this 2022-23 budget for the conservative Texas budget uses population growth of 2.6% over the last 2 fiscal years, over fiscal years 2019 and 2020, and 2.4% growth rate in inflation over those 2 fiscal years. Add them together, you get 5%. So the growth rate, the maximum growth rate for the budget, mind you, okay, is 5%. And when you take the base, the 2020-21 budget that we're currently in, that budget cycle now, it's a $234.4 billion budget. When you exclude items last time of one-time extraordinary items that were going to Harvey of about $8 billion, and then property tax relief of $5 billion, that's $13 billion. When you take that out, that's what you get from the 248 to the $234.4 billion. And then you increase that by 5%, that's what you get to $246.1 billion. And this session, just like we did last session, will continue to exclude one-time expenditures. This money that's coming in from the federal government through the CARES Act and other sort of expenditures, we'll also exclude that in the 2022-23 budget or the 2021 budget, because some of that's going to go into that as well. I remember seeing that, the last year I spent some time at the White House as the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget, and watched a lot of those monies be flowed through Congress, right? And I know we'll get into this in a little bit, but I think we've also got to be careful how much of those dollars are being spent and make sure that we don't consider those to be a new baseline, the new base that we're going to then build on in the future, because those are just one-time extraordinary items, because hopefully Texas families, businesses across this great state will soon have the freedom, the liberty, and the ability to be more prosperous once we get past the restrictions that are in place now from COVID-19 and other factors, because that will also help the Texas Comptroller, Glenn Hager, to figure out what the tax receipts picture is going to be. And, the reason why we're releasing this now is because the legislature is currently looking at the legislative appropriations requests from agencies to start to put together what the overall budget's going to be. And then soon, next month in October, or early November, the Legislative Budget Board will come together and determine the growth rate for the 2022-23 budget that they're going to use. And we'll talk about some of those differences as well. So I think we have extraordinary opportunity. We've seen great success from the conservative Texas budget, and we just got to keep that going.
Thank you, Vance. I want you to expand on a couple of things that you mentioned that I think are very, very important. First of all, the consistency of what the conservative Texas budget is and the way in which it's calculated, because ultimately what we're not doing here is recommending a budget level. We're recommending and putting forth a consistent methodological, I can say that, a consistent approach through methods that we can consistently apply to the legislature to say, look, we have determined consistently from year to year what the needs of the state of Texas are, but more importantly, what the ability of Texas taxpayers are. And we do that through population and inflation. So expand on that too, the difference between this threshold, what it means versus a recommendation to spend. We're not recommending that they spend actually $246 billion. We're just actually looking at a threshold.
That's right. And so this is a threshold. It's a maximum threshold overall. So hopefully it's something below this amount, given the situation that we're in with our economy, with Texas families struggling all across this great state. We also are one of 49 states that have a balanced budget amendment, which means that we must balance our budget every biennium. Okay. And so this amount here means that we've got to bring in the same amount of tax dollars. So the more that we spend, the more that we're going to have to tax overall. The current spending limit that we have in the state is based on general revenue not dedicated by the Constitution, which is about 45% of the overall budget, 45, 50%, let's say half of the overall budget. And it's based on the growth rate of personal income that's determined in statute. Well, and then it uses the projection, right? What is the projected personal income growth over the next 2 fiscal years? That's a long time away. And by the time that they're actually making this forecast, it ends up being almost a 3-year projection of what's going to happen with personal income growth. And when you're talking about the size of the state's economy, which is the 10th largest economy in the world, it's very difficult to project that amount. It's difficult enough to project what gas prices are going to be next week, much less an entire economy the size of Texas, right? And so what we looked at is, we need to reform our overall spending limit. That's another reason why this came up. We were growing too fast with our budget, meaning we were taxing too much over time. It was too volatile of our overall budget. So we need to reform our spending limit to one that covers the entire budget, including federal funds, which the legislature does have some discretion over as well. It also, the key point here though, is that this is what taxpayers are also funding. Doesn't matter if it's from the left pocket that's paying for state sort of spending, or from the right pocket where you're paying the federal government for spending, it's still coming out of my pockets, all right, and your pockets, and all the audience that are watching pockets. And so it really should be the entire budget. And we need to get away from using personal income growth, which is a very volatile measure, to something that's more stable and that better reflects the taxpayer's ability to pay, like population growth plus inflation does. And look, population inflation is stable over time. It's 5% this time. Last time it was 8% when we came out with this. Personal income can grow from 12% to 2% to 6%. It's very volatile. So if you're a business trying to plan on what your taxes are going to be, it makes it more difficult to determine if there is a volatile measure that's being used. And for families trying to predict what their taxes are going to be, the same is true. And the more that we can keep spending limited, spending ultimately drives taxes and it drives regulations, right? If you don't spend money on a regulatory agency, they can't really put regulations in place. So I think the spending side of it is so important when we're looking at this, that we've really got to figure out, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this to really put the taxpayer first.
So let me get you to expand on one more point before we turn it over to James, and that is you mentioned exclusions from the calculations, and I don't want the audience to misunderstand what we're talking about with excluded. We want to include all calculations in the budget. When you're talking about exclusions, you're talking about for purposes of projecting the growth of the budget and limiting that growth and measuring what the budget is as the baseline from last year to this year. And that's where we actually exclude certain, as you said, one-time expenditures, because those are aberrations, such as Hurricane Harvey relief, or in this case, COVID-19 relief, or whatever the case may be. Any of those expenditures are not a true measure of what the government is needing to expend, assuming that they determine it to be needed on a year-to-year basis.
That's right. And so these are kind of extraordinary items, if you think about it that way. Hurricane Harvey was, we know we're going to have a hurricane season, but you don't always know what the extent of that hurricane season is going to be. We didn't know Hurricane Harvey was going to have such an effect along the Gulf Coast. And this time we have COVID-19, another thing that was unprecedented and has a major cost overall, that we need to make sure that those costs and the money that we're receiving from the federal government doesn't go into the new baseline. To your point, we need to exclude these items from the baseline, because if we don't, we get to a situation where we have a bloated budget, that we're using more and more of these one-time items to grow the budget, instead of things like healthcare, education, transportation, things that, we can discuss whether or not we should be spending the right amount now, but those are probably areas where the government's going to spend money on. And so let's really focus on those. I also wanted to mention that Texas has been doing a pretty good job when it comes to spending over time. Not only have we reduced the growth rate in the last 3 sessions, which is important, but when you compare us to other states, in per capita terms, spending as a share of our population, we rank 12th best, having the lowest amount of spending. 12th doesn't sound that great to many of us in Texas, okay? But if you look at it at the spending as a share of gross domestic product or gross state product, our overall economic output, we rank 4th best, 4th lowest. That's more like it here in Texas, okay? And we need to keep going into that level, not to just be number 1, which is great. We like to do that in Texas.
Nothing wrong with that.
I know, but ultimately it's about Texas families, right? Giving them more opportunity to put food on their table, decide how they're going to send their kids to college and things of that nature, instead of more money going to government. And look, there are certainly roles for government, but those should be few and far between, or a few of them, to make sure that we're just preserving liberty overall and not crowding out the budgets of the private sector at large. And we were doing that for a while. We have this other figure 2 in our paper. In those earlier years before 2015, these 5 budget periods, we had an excessive amount of government growth. That amount of government growth then compounded over time to where it was much higher than population inflation would have suggested over that same period. So if you compare the budget, the actual budget, to population and inflation, we're spending $36.7 billion more during the current budget cycle than otherwise, which breaks down to $2,500 more for an average family of 4 that we're paying in higher taxes to pay for our government. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to go out and cut. I know some people will say, wow, $6.7 billion, we need to cut all that now. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that we need to keep on a path to converging, getting back to a situation where we're government spending within the taxpayer's ability to pay. And we can do that by doing what we've done over the last 3 sessions, and just keep that process going from here on out.
Thank you, Vance. James, let me ask you, you're an old hand at this. You've been around a while, and you have been instrumental in the past in efforts here at the foundation to look for ways to rein in the growth of budget. We were talking about how to constrain the growth of that budget, but ultimately what we'd really like to see is actually reducing the budget. And there are a number of efforts. Certainly, We applaud the leadership. The governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker have called upon every state agency, with some exceptions, to identify cuts as much as 5%. We here at the foundation have suggested that those cuts need to be identified at least as high as 15%, in some cases perhaps more. There's a number of ways we could go about doing that, but one of the things that I want you to expand upon is your efforts in the past and here at the foundation to try to provide more transparency to the budget itself, so that not just legislators and budget writers, but taxpayers can identify and see what programs cost, not just an overall picture, an overall number, but individual programs, individual types of expenditures, and see what they actually cost, so that they can weigh in with their own legislators and see if they can't put some pressure on constraining that growth. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you, Rod, and congratulations to Dr. Ginn and his team. I think the advent of the conservative Texas budget has truly been instrumental in helping to control the growth of state government spending, as is evidenced by this chart here. Clearly, Dr. Ginn has been doing a much better job during his tenure than I was ever able to do. My first session was 2009, and I kind of rabble-roused all the way up until about 2014-ish, I believe. So congratulations on developing and moving forward an excellent concept that has absolutely changed the game when it comes to the state budget. Now, Rod, to your question about transparency and arming people with the tools that they need to be effective in this fight, because it is a fight. You have a lot of proponents on the other side who see nothing but an opportunity to spend when they gavel in every 2 years. And when it comes to budget transparency, I think one of the best things that the Legislative Budget Board has done over the last several years is actually move the state budget online, so that anybody with access to the internet can begin to delve into all 1,000 pages of this document here. But it's not just that the document is online. They've actually changed the format of it. And this is a problem that I think dates back many years. If you go and you look at the General Appropriations Act as it's currently laid out in its formal fashion, what you see is that it's organized by strategies and goals, and a lot of information undergirds those two elements. It's not laid out in a fashion where the average person can go in and say, okay, well, I'm spending X number of dollars for Y number of products. It's not laid out in that fashion. And I think that is a feature, not a bug. And what I mean to say is I think a long time ago, those who wanted to spend a lot more money were able to manipulate the system in such a way that there was a certain element of opaqueness that came into play. And so, but what the LBB has done, and kudos to them, I believe this was in early 2012 or 2013. I could be getting my years wrong, but it's been online for a while now, where they've taken the budget document and they've put it up online in a program-based budgeting format. So now you can actually go online and see that the Medicaid program, for instance, spends X number of state dollars, X number of Y dollars. The statutory justifications are posted online. You have a lot of information, common sense information that I think the average person would need to kind of grasp what's happening there. Not only that, there's some search functions that I encourage everyone to take advantage of. If you want to have a little bit of fun, again, go to the Legislative Budget Board's website, look for the budget, and then using their search tool, input certain terms like wine or marketing, and then, you know, or some other creative term. And I guarantee you'll find at least one or two expenditures that you might take issue with, or might at least ask a question about, you know, why is state government involved in this particular activity?
Yeah, that's a terrific point, and that is a terrific tool, and thank you for that, James. Talk a little bit about zero-based, but expand a little more on zero-based budgeting, because transparency encompasses what you just described and being able to see the program level expenditures. But beyond that, you were talking, I think, a minute ago about how the budget is sort of structured in terms of measures and performance achievements and things of that nature. And it's a little difficult to sort all that out other than the terrific online tool that you mentioned on the LBB website. But what could we do that's even better if we move to more of a zero-based budget concept?
Sure, great question. So one of the things that I see as a challenge moving forward into the next biennium is we have a huge budget gap, not only for the current biennium but the next, right? And it kind of brings to mind a situation back in 2003 when our friend and colleague Talmadge Heflin was chairing the House Appropriations Committee. You know, they came into a session with a $10 billion budget gap, right? A huge hurdle. It'd be a huge hurdle now. It was a huge, even more massive hurdle then. And one of the first things,
which is about twice what it is now, or what has most recently been announced of $4.6 billion.
Yeah. So, I mean,
current.
A lot of money. I mean, they were in a big hole. And one of the first things that they did was they implemented a really aggressive zero-based budgeting strategy. And what zero-based budgeting is it's basically building the budget from zero. You wipe away all previous expenditures, and then you require an agency head or a department to justify every new spending item, right? And they were able, in that time frame, in that 2003 session, they were able to close a $10 billion budget shortfall without raising taxes. It was an absolutely incredible feat. It set the tone, I think, for the next 15 years of prosperity that we enjoyed. And it really changed the game in terms of the state budget. We're facing a very similar situation now. And I think we have an opportunity to take this on in a very similar and aggressive fashion. And I was very encouraged actually to hear recently Senator Nelson back in May came out and said, we are going to require every state agency to start their budget from zero. So she's doing exactly that, much to her credit. This is in addition to a bill that Madam Chair and Representative Schaefer passed in the last legislative session, Senate Bill 68, which requires every agency under sunset review to basically undergo Texas's version of zero-based budgeting called strategic fiscal review. And so, you know, she's in building upon that particular legislation instead of subjecting just those subset of agencies. She's saying everyone has to do this. That's a great thing because we have some big hurdles to overcome, and it's only by controlling spending are we really going to get to the heart of the issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, because you know, right now, like as mentioned earlier, the Texas Comptroller says we're going to have about a $4.6 billion deficit. That's a budget deficit, not just a revenue drop, but a budget deficit when you look at general revenue. So the area of the budget where they arguably have the most control over. So there was a reduction in general revenue. If you look at the total budget so far, it's actually up. If you look at federal funds as well, because there was a lot of money that came in from the CARES Act between state and local of about $12 billion. And so that money has flowed in, increasing the amount of money that's available. But there is this general revenue where they're going to have to fill $4.6 billion. And so we've got to be able to find where savings should come from. And Rod, you mentioned it earlier, the governor, lieutenant governor, the speaker, they called for 5% in savings from some state agencies. And from what I understand, that adds up to about $1 billion. So there's still $3.6 billion that would need to be filled, that part of the gap, which is one reason why we've put out there that we need a range, 5 to 15%. Heck, I mean, our executive director, Kevin Roberts, mentioned the other day, 25%, so there needs to be some sort of range where you can get an idea of where the cuts should be. And this zero-based budgeting or strategic fiscal review sort of idea is a great way to do that because that's what Texas families are doing. Yeah, I don't know about y'all, but, I use an online app that I kind of go through with my budget, and I use zero-based budgeting. Where do we need more money at? And make sure that I have enough for savings as well. And oh, by the way, we do have a savings account here in Texas called the Economic Stabilization Fund, also known as the Rainy Day Fund. And even with the issues that we've seen in the oil and gas sector, And even with the decline in receipts in the economy overall, they're expecting to have about $9 billion in the rainy day fund at the end of the current biennium. So $9 billion, you use a couple of $1 billion to plug the hole, which was the reason why it was created. It was created to cover tax receipt shortfalls, not for a lot of the other stuff that they use it for. Okay, but it was used for that. It was meant to be used for that. You use it for that, maybe a couple $1 billion. You could still be within the amount that the credit rating agencies would give us a AAA rating. And I think that would be another potentially good use for it in this situation. But ultimately, it comes back to spending. Spending, we don't have a revenue problem, right? We have a spending problem. And I think we need to keep talking about that. And that was what's so important about the conservative Texas budget, to keep that in place. And look, I mean, during these trying times for the state, for families, for businesses, we've got to make sure that we use every avenue to cut programs that aren't effective anymore. With that large of a budget, we've got to figure out a way to do more of that. And I think strategic zero-based budgeting would be a great place to do something like that.
To that point, real quick, Vance, one of the things, and this criticism is actually probably more applicable to the local level, but it does exist in state government as well. In the absence, the audience may be wondering what happens in the absence of zero-based budgeting. What's the status quo, right? It really revolves around a current services model where you take last year's budget number, you build on a certain percentage across the board, 6, 7, 8%, and you move forward. Well, if you do that enough over time, what ends up happening is you build in inefficiencies in the system, because not everything that you spent last year are you going to need next year, but oftentimes that'll still get funded. And so large inefficiencies tend to get built up in these systems. And by doing a zero-based budgeting sweep, you're actually eliminating a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, and Rod, you and I have talked a lot about this from being at the state agency back in the day. I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts and experiences there.
Yeah, well, first of all, y'all are both touched on a number of great points that we need to expand on. Okay. But you're right, the primary thing that you mentioned that we have to remember is that when the government looks at budgeting, we're even talking about what we've talked about percentage cuts, and the leadership has requested a 5% budget cut identification from each agency. We're suggesting as high as 15 or 25 or 30, as Kevin mentioned the other day.
And just to clarify, that's in the current budget. That's 2021.
And that's the point. That's the point of it is most Texans, I don't believe, individuals and families go about setting their budgets that way. You don't say, I'm just going to arbitrarily pick a number of a percentage increase or decrease. I mean, you're basing your budget on what your needed expenditures are and what you have available. And at least I think the responsible budgeters would look at what their income levels are, not just what their income and savings are, because savings are just that. They're savings. You do want to provide for some savings that would be in times of need. And that's what the rainy day fund, the Economic Stabilization Fund, is for here in Texas. We dipped into it last time for Hurricane Harvey. There's nothing like the greatest rain event in the history of weather forecasting that was Hurricane Harvey, to dip into the rainy day fund. That was a rainy day by definition. But if there's going to be some effort to dip into that again, and there likely will be, you don't start with that. And so you don't start with the program of saying, well, let's look at what all available funds are. You definitely want to see that. The comptroller will be trying to estimate that, but the comptroller has given great caution out there, and I think he was very, very adamant, both in writing and his public speaking, about how the revenue projections going forward, coming out of this pandemic, are very, very unsettled. So talk a little bit about how we build on that revenue projection, but also, as you mentioned, not really relying on that entirely, but instead saying, yeah, we really actually need to look at cutting the budget as much as possible, looking at only what is absolutely needed for Texas taxpayers and the state of Texas in general, before we look at what available revenue there might be.
No, that's a great point, and I think it's very important to to do that given the situation that we're in. So in this current 2021, what they call biennium, 2-year budget cycle, that's where this pandemic is going to hit, and the government lockdowns and the effect that that's had on the economy, and therefore tax receipts that have come in, it's going to take a huge hit. It's at $4.6 billion. I don't know. Is it going to be higher than that? It depends on the bounce back of the overall economy. If the economy bounces back even faster, we're going to see a smaller overall deficit. But we need to be prepared with where those dollars need to come from along the way to find cuts within this 2021 cycle. Now, since we have a balanced
but
budget,
also, and just so I don't,
Yep.
just so I don't forget, I
Yeah.
don't mean to cut you off, but we also have to remember as we come out of this economic downturn that not every individual Texan is going to come out at the same level and to the same at the same speed. And so you're going to still have some that are lagging a little bit behind. And so we've got to be mindful of that and not constrain their growth going forward. And so even if the overall economy is growing, and that's great news, we shouldn't just spend all of that and say it's all done, because there are some taxpayers that are still going to be getting their own house in order before they're able to get to fully pay their way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it goes back to remember the taxpayer throughout all this. And we were just talking about it the other day, where just think about last session. Last session, there was a $5 billion cut to property taxes, right? They also left $3 billion on the table that they could have otherwise have spent. Had they spent every dollar, we would have been in a worse budget situation than we are now. And had they not done the $5 billion in property tax relief, we would have higher taxes on property holders throughout the state. So that helped us to be in a better position than we otherwise would. Would we have liked them to spend a little bit less? Sure. But, you know, they were right near the 8% growth rate that we had, which was very important to keep this process going of passing conservative budgets. And I think another thing we need to be mindful of is that all this federal money, not only is it one time, which is why we would exclude it if it's related explicitly to COVID-19, but we can't use it to build up the budget for the next budget cycle. We can't build it into our baseline, to your point earlier. We've done that before. We saw what happened after the American Recovery Reinvestment Act under the Obama administration during the Great Recession. There was a huge amount of influx of funds that came into Texas. A lot of that money went into education to fill in some of those gaps of less funding overall at that time from the state. It filled in the gap. Well, when that money went away from the federal government, people started to complain that education spending has went down. You remember that? But if you actually look at the numbers, the numbers show that even in real dollars, inflation adjusted dollars, the dollars for education didn't go down. It was just that they were inflated. They were bloated, if you think about it in that capacity. And we thought of them as being permanent. And that is not the case. And so we've got to be mindful that we can't do that again this session either, because there's going to be a huge amount, you know, $12 billion so far. Some states are asking for more. So far, and I'm thankful that Texas has not asked Congress for any more funding. We at the Texas Public Policy Foundation have been on the record saying, look, no more state and local funding bailouts from Congress. We need to get our own fiscal house in order, to your point, right? Get our fiscal house in order here and what we're spending our money on, so that taxpayers aren't feeling the brunt of that. Just today, the jobless claims numbers come out. I look for this every Thursday, okay? And the continued jobless claims, meaning people who are actually receiving unemployment benefits in Texas, it's still almost 1 million. Back in February, it was 130,000. We have 10 times more people are getting unemployment benefits today than they did back then. That is a lot of hurt that's going on across this great state. And even though the unemployment rate has dropped now to 6.8%, which is about half of what it was back in April, just a couple months ago, that 6.8% is about twice the rate it was, the unemployment rate was in February of 3.5%. So things have improved, but there's still a lot more room for improvement. And we can't do that if we're spending too much by government.
I mean, it's a great point, and I think it's the common thread that we are trying to get across here today is that you don't just let the budget grow on its own just because inflation is what it is, or just because population and inflation continue to grow, doesn't mean the budget should automatically grow. Going back to the conservative Texas budget, we're simply saying it should never grow greater than the population plus inflation, for sure. But certainly these efforts are underway right now. You talked about state agency budgets, and my experience of doing that, I put out more budgets than I care to remember. In many cases, with some significant cuts. Every agency, particularly the larger agencies, can do that. And people have to remember, we're always talking about these agencies. They're undergoing this process right now. It's referred to as the legislative appropriation request. So it's just that. The agencies are coming forward and requesting. That's the first piece. But you're right. Part of the effort is sort of a built-in increase, because most agencies are given numbers by the Legislative Budget Board, and they show a baseline, and that baseline is, well, whatever you were expending before. And so even when agencies come forward and say, well, I think I can reduce my budget, they almost have to prove that up just as much as if they were requesting a budget increase. And that, I think, needs to have some discussion here. There's some processes in the budget system at the legislature that I think we need to make it, frankly, a little easier and provide greater incentives for agencies to find those cuts. You talked about the success that Chairman Heflin had back in 2003. And I think James was talking about it in detail. And part of that was because he knew, and the legislature knew at that time, that, look, we've got a lot of high paid executives in these agencies, and their job is to run those agencies as effectively, but also as efficiently as possible. They can find cuts if you tell them to, and if you give them that direction and that flexibility to say, you find those cuts, we're going to make it easier for you to do that. Now, we expect you to still be effective at whatever your task is. So, back to the point about whether it's regulation or safety and security or healthcare or whatever the case it may be, there are some public policy goals that the legislature have set. We may have agreements or disagreements about those, but once they set those, there's a cost associated with that. But beyond that, there's always efficiencies that these agencies can have, and we need to empower them and to work with them as partners and give them those tools and that flexibility and encourage them to find those cuts. And I know they can find cuts greater than 5%, and I think we're going to get there. James, let me kick it back over to you. While we're talking about government just kind of constantly growing, we're talking about the state budget here, but local governments seem to spend a lot of money as well, and I think taxpayers. Yeah, lately I've heard a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about some of your efforts and identification of some good actors and bad actors out there on the local level, and what we can do to constrain that growth.
Sure. So one of the things that I think the Texas Public Policy Foundation excelled at during the last legislative session was really advocating for some good government reforms to be included in House Bill 3. That was, of course, the big school finance reform bill, a major piece of legislation that did a lot. One of the very first items, I think it's actually included on page 1 of House Bill 3. One of the very, very first items included in that bill is an efficiency audit concept. And I think this has an application or the potential for application, not only to other types of local governments, but also to state government as well. And so just real briefly, the concept as we dreamed it up was to basically bring in a third-party auditor and require a governmental entity to open up the books, right? Let's take a look at your budget and operations, have an outside set of eyes come and see, is the money that's being spent commensurate with the services or goods being produced, right? And what ended up happening in the context of House Bill 3 is the legislature decided to require school districts seeking a tax increase to first go and have an efficiency audit conducted. And then before they could, again, move forward with the tax increase, they would have to make this audit public and also hold a hearing or two on it, right? And so basically the idea is to disseminate the information to the broader public to either bolster confidence that a tax increase is needed or to show the public that, hey, there's some areas that maybe we need to work on, and we'll be back maybe at a later date. And I think that idea, again, has an application not only in the city and county context, and we'll be working on that during this next legislative session, but also as it applies to state government, because I think most of us recognize up here, we have a rough idea of where maybe some state agency expenditures could be cut or reduced. But actually bringing in a third-party independent auditor to do a thorough examination of all spending and all operations is something that at least exceeds, my know-how. And I think that the public would greatly benefit from such a tool. And of course, it's a little too late to really impact, I think, this upcoming biennium. But should the legislature choose to implement something like this at the state level with an eye, and this is just my own personal hunch, with an eye towards institutions of higher education, I think there could be a lot of value there in again, bringing an outside set of eyes to review all spending with an eye towards stretching dollars, especially in today's environment.
Well, and it's an interesting point, and certainly at the state level, there are a number of tools that are already available that I think we could expand on for that point. The state auditor's office is a large agency who goes around and just by definition audits many of these agencies. Also, most agencies have to have an internal audit process as well. So I think we could expand on those functions and just see, are they really getting down to those kinds of efficiency audits to try to identify savings that exist? Again, I think some of the better managers and better executives at these agencies are already undertaking that goal. But ultimately, it goes beyond just those agencies and those executives. There are outside parties that put pressure both ways. So, be heard, because it's not just the taxpayer that complains to the legislature about overspending. There are outside parties, special interest, regulated entities that actually want these agencies to do more in many cases. Sometimes it's not in the best interest of taxpayers. And we need to always be on guard of that. And everybody needs to be heard so that the legislators are making the proper decisions for everyone.
And real quick, Rod, this isn't an idea that is totally foreign to the world of public finance, right? There are some really good third parties out there who do an excellent job. And in fact, I just want to highlight a couple of instances where I think they've been really effective. Right, you have a Detroit Public Schools a few years ago was facing a $300 million budget deficit. They had one of these audit companies come in, identified $53 million of annual savings. Of course, that's a recurring saving, so a lot of money to be found there. The state of Kansas in 2016, in that particular audit, the auditors identified 105 separate recommendations that would have generated $2 billion in savings over 5 years. And the last one in Wyoming in 2017, just a few years ago, those auditors identified between 12.9 million and 17.7 million in one-time savings, and between 112 and $227 million in savings over each 2-year budget cycle. So, there are opportunities really, I think, to introduce efficiency in a much greater fashion, not only at the state level, but with our local government guys in mind too.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because with the population growth and inflation, looking at remembering the taxpayer, right? And having that as being a good measure when you look at the research on this area of public finance as measuring the taxpayer's ability to pay. It goes back to Senate Bill 2 last session on property tax reform, lowering the rate with the rollback rate from 8% down to 3.5%, where you get an automatic election. It triggered an automatic election. Where did 3.5% come from? It was very similar to population growth and inflation. Yeah, I think it was over the last 20 years, if you look at on an annual basis, population inflation hasn't exceeded 4%. So it's pretty dang close to that. And ultimately, what we should try to get down to is to make it to where each local taxing entity would not grow by more than, like a spending limit side, not grow by more than population inflation, just like the state has to do or should do. And I ultimately think it's something I worked hard on at the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, that the federal government should have something like a responsible American budget, that they need to finally actually start to pass budgets, for one thing, up there in Congress, but they need to have restraints as well. Because even though they can issue deficits and issue new debt, there is a cost to that, and so we need to actually keep this all throughout government, every level of government, getting back to responsible budgeting, because ultimately, who pays for it? We do. Taxpayers do, all across this great state, the folks in our audience, all these folks do. And so we've really got to keep that in mind, whether it's the local, state, or at the federal level, because every one of these dollars comes out of our pockets and puts a strain on our overall prosperity that we could have.
Absolutely well said, and great points to both of you. We do have a few questions from our audience. So let me ask, I'm gonna put a couple of these together since we're running a little bit short on time. What is I'm gonna open this up to both of you, but we'll start with you, Vance. What is the biggest threat to passing a conservative Texas budget, and how can I contribute to encouraging the legislature to adopt it?
Yes. So I'll go with the second part first, is mainly contacting your local representative and senator. Talk to them, right? They really reach out as much as possible. Continue to follow the work that we're doing as we're pushing out information that we hope will then be disseminated to make some of those decisions. There is an argument out there that some would say, well, you know what, we're not even going to have 5% in revenue to meet this conservative budget. But I think that we could, depending on the bounce back of the overall economy. The Texas Comptroller will release the biennial revenue estimate in January, right before session starts, that will give them the amount of revenue they're going to have available, either to backfill the 2021 budget and cover any deficit there, and then to budget for the upcoming biennium. And so, you typically could see during a strong economic period, 11, 12% growth. And given the bounce back now, it could be even more than that, depending on what the economy is going to do. So I think that there is a threat for not only the amount of revenue that we could see coming into the state and all those dollars being spent, but also if money is used out of the rainy day fund, that would also go towards the overall spending of the conservative Texas budget, excluding any one-time items for the COVID-19, again, it's sort of situation. But so I do think there is a threat. I do think it's something that we need to be cautious about. And look, as good fiscal conservatives, these sort of downturns give us a way to get to more efficient, good government programs, that we start to look at where is every dollar being spent and how can we make sure that it's being spent wisely.
Thank you for that, Vance and James. I think we're coming to the end of the program. Any quick final thoughts to our viewers, how to reach out? We've already talked about that a little bit, but any parting thoughts?
We'll have our paper online shortly after this at texaspolicy.com. I hope everyone will check it out and see and find out some more of the details that we've discussed today.
Great point. And in fact, while you're on there, go ahead and search around. You could look at the past conservative Texas budgets. There's also a great deal of information, both on the Remember the Taxpayer campaign and the campaign for the American, Government for the People. I'm sorry. I don't work directly with them. There's a little overlap. We all work together, but there's a lot of information out there for everyone to peruse and learn from. Keep up to date. This is a moving target, but the conservative Texas budget is not, as what we were trying to say, what it is and isn't. Remember, if you want to have your voice heard, the conservative Texas budget is a threshold. We're not suggesting that this is the expenditure level. This is the maximum growth that we should have in the budget. This should be the cap. And then from that, we should actually be looking for expenditure cuts. We're going to continue to look for that here at the foundation, and we appreciate your efforts, and we appreciate you joining with us today. Thank you very much.